Welcome, everyone. My name is Bob Lawrence. I'm the director of the Center for Livable Future, and we're very pleased to have you here for the 9th annual Edward and Nancy Dodge Lecture. First, a word about Ed Dodge and his late wife Nancy and his wife Carol, who are with us today. Ed is a graduate of the school. He obtained his MPH here and then completed the general preventive medicine residency in Ethiopia, where he worked in public health before returning to the U.S. And first serving as a health officer and then a primary care physician. When the Center for a Livable Future was established in 1996, Ed was the first alumnus to step forward and say, I like this idea. And he directed the Dodge Family Foundation to establish a fund that has endowed the Dodge Lectureship. It's particularly gratifying that Ed and Carol have been to most of these, and in fact have, after the Dodge lecturer has completed his or her presentation, they have gone to visit the site where the work being described was done. And earlier today, we had a commitment. I think it's fair to say that Carol and Ed will be going to India sometime in the next year. It is very interesting that our distinguished visitor and this year's Dodge lecturer, Dr. Vandana Shiva, is the 9th Dodge lecturer because her organization, Navdanya, means 9 seeds. So there's some kind of karmic harmony here that is really wonderful. Now, in your program, you can read a number of things about Dr. Shiva. I'm just going to mention a few others that were not there. First of all, those of you who know that part of the mission of the Center for a Livable Future, with our so-called Taylor-Boland model, Carl Taylor being here with us today, he and John Boland, among the early advisors to the Center for a Livable Future, we developed our conceptual framework, and central drivers are population and equity. So the mission of Navdanya is to protect nature and people's rights to knowledge, biodiversity, water, and food. And the vision statement for Navdanya, and this is the first NGO that I've ever seen use as a vision statement an article from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So Article 25 of the UN DHR, established in December 10th, 1948, says everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of themselves and their family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond their control. Motherhood and childhood are entitled to special care and assistance. And I know that after you listen to Dr. Shiva, you will appreciate that only a woman as remarkable as she could take on Article 25 of the Universal Declaration in her work. Trained as a physicist at the University of Western Ontario, Dr. Shiva has then long been involved in working on ecology, on organic food, and basically community development in India. Her mission, in addition to that article from the UDHR, is to focus on improving the well-being of small and marginalized rural producers through nonviolent, biodiverse organic farming and fair trade. Biodiverse organic farming produces more food and nutrition and brings higher incomes to farmers than monocultures and chemical farming. While avoiding environmental harm, biodiverse organic farming is also an insurance in times of climate change. Furthermore, keeping seeds, biodiversity, and traditional knowledge in people's hands to generate livelihoods and provide basic needs is Navdanya's core program for poverty alleviation. So we are so grateful to you, Dr. Shiva, for traveling all the way from Delhi to be with us. And we look forward to your 9th Dodge lecture, not your 9th, our 9th, your first. But we hope from this day on we'll be collaborating on that wonderful mission you've set about. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Vandana Shiva.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Center for Livable Futures as well as Dr. Dodge and Carol for making it possible for me to be here with you today. It's the gap between public health and food systems has been troubling me for a while because food is quite clearly the most essential aspect of health. One of the ancient texts that I love from India is a whole Upanishad dedicated to food. And it says, basically something all ecologists know in the web of life. It says, everything is food. Everything is something else's food. And it's humbling for humans to recognize they're not the top of the pyramid. They're just the food for microbes. The Sanitary Upanishad also says that the highest dharma, the highest right livelihood, the highest right living, is the growing and giving of food in abundance. And it talks about how the highest adharma, the highest sin, is serving bad food. But somehow along the way, we've turned food into a system where serving bad food has become the only way food gets served, unless you're a slow food member or you have a wonderful grandmother or you're in a culture that hasn't been devastated by agribusiness, the processed food economy, or I think even the feeding agencies. I tore this out of this Time magazine. I think it's the back cover. It's a little puddle of dirty water with a fork and a knife, and it says, when you're starving, anything looks appetizing. And I think that's an insult to the hungry. I think an agency like the World Food Program, assuming that anything can be served to the hungry, is unjust, immoral, degrading. And that's why I treat the Human Rights Declaration as vital, that we are all equal, we are all human, and for all humans, the food we eat ends up being us. And you can't cheat the web of life. Industry has tried, but the result of that cheating has been, on the one hand, 1 billion people without food, and equally tragic, 2 billion people cursed for eating food that shouldn't have been called food. I was very involved with the Wto issues, and Wto is an interesting institution. It's interesting both because it tried to be, because right now it's in intensive care, thank goodness. But it tried to be the world's parliament, it tried to be the world's court, and it tried to be the world's executive. They actually announced, we are now the new world constitution. And the constitution says, live by greed and competition alone. But the interesting thing with WTO negotiations used to be they used to have non-papers. They used to have non-working groups. Now, these are all things that are not supposed to be going on record. And once giving a talk at a parallel meeting in WTO, I said, basically, you should be talking about negotiating non-food. Because what you're dealing with in terms of shipping stuff around is not food anymore. You have turned food into the ultimate commodity, and the commodity is not food. This has, on the one hand, meant that food has been taken away for millions. I mean, no matter where you are, you could be in the Amazon forest, you could be in the Arctic, there's food. I'm a vegetarian. I remember my rainforest friends 20 years ago did a rainforest conference from the Arctic to the Amazon and forgot that most of the people in the Arctic and in the Amazon eat a lot of meat. And they made a wonderful vegetarian conference. But there is food in the Arctic. There might not be plants. Lots of sea life. Food is everywhere. But we have shrunk our categories of food to so narrow a base that its production has become more and more energy wasteful, more and more capital intensive, more and more structured in ways that the billion people that go hungry and the Millennium Development Goals constantly try to address reducing them by half. But in the last year alone, every agency, whether it was the World Bank with an assessment of 200 million or the World Food Program with an assessment of 115 million, an additional 100 million, 200 million were added to the hungry people of the world. And the assessments also are that from 2009 to 2015, if current trends continue, more than 200,000 to 400,000 a year will die of not having enough food to eat. This is more than all the deaths in all the wars. Interestingly, while the economy was growing, that's before September 2008, there was an assumption that the higher the growth rate, the more the access to food. And in the early 90s, when our economy was changed to what has, it's described in many ways, the globalized economy, the liberalized economy, the trade-driven economy. In 91, when all those changes were made to the Indian economy and then accelerated in 95 with the establishment of the World Trade Organization, we had 170 kilograms per capita per year of entitlement to food. India has been growing in the last decade, and of course, India and China are also always pointed out to as the emerging economic giants, etc. We've had growth rates of 9%, 10%. And yet, in this decade, the per capita entitlement to food has dropped to 150 kilograms per capita per year, which is as bad as the entitlement during the Great Bengal Famine. The Great Bengal Famine was the period where the British were exporting the rice grown in India, and even those who had grown the rice couldn't eat it. And it was financing the war, but the rice growers of Bengal and Orissa and Bihar were dying. 2 million people died. And it took the women, the peasant women, came out and stood with their little brooms in front of their rice harvest. And a movement emerged at that point called Tibhaga, and it was a movement to defend the right to food. And basically the women said, we will give our lives, we will not give our rice. And we have murals and pictures in Bengal villages with the army and police with guns on one side and the women with brooms on the other side saying, we need this rice. Totally started to, this was 42. 42 onwards, the independence movement accelerated, and out of it we created a food system which started to feed all Indians, a food distribution system. I won't go into all the details about how it was structured, but all of that was dismantled as part of the new policies. The policies now were no more food first, they were export first. Policies now were no more about right to food, they were about find your way through the market. And the poor who've been excluded, who've been robbed of their land, who've been denied their livelihoods, are the ones who cannot access food through the market. So we've had this decline at the national level, and at the state level, Bihar has gone down from 175 kilograms per capita per year to 121, Gujarat from 114 to 96. This is just in the last decade. Karnataka has actually improved its attainment. Madhya Pradesh has gone down from 331 to 207. Tamil Nadu from 131 to 102. Maharashtra from 145 to 110. So we're seeing a huge decline in entitlement. And while this entitlement has been declining, of course, food prices rose last year. You might remember May, the FAO had to call a global food summit to address the food crisis. And a little before that, I can't remember the exact month, but President Bush, who sounds like history now, but was very real at that time, he actually said the reason there is a food price rise is because the Indians are getting rich. And by getting rich, they're eating more and eating better and putting a pressure on the world food prices. But Indians weren't eating more. The figures I've given you of decline in food consumption show that Indians weren't eating more. Actually, the US consumption of cereals shot up last year by 12%. It wasn't that the American citizens were eating more. It's just that the American cars were eating more food. The diversion to biofuels was a large part of the problem. And the second part of the drive, 75% for food that went into making of biodiesel from soya and ethanol from corn. But a large part was also speculation of food as a commodity. Because housing had collapsed as a place for making super profits. And all the hedge funds and investment banks thought 25% can't make it in real estate, we'll make it in food. And it drove, for those few months, it drove the prices up. In some places to double, and 40 countries had food riots. So the fact that there is a big food problem on our hands, I think is now recognized. What isn't recognized is how we got here and how we get out of it. One issue that was actually the reason I even got into agriculture. It's not what when I was 18, someone had asked me, will you do something in agriculture? I said, no. I ran out of my first biology class. I have a sister who's done medicine, and I couldn't stand the sight of her textbooks. I've always found neat equations better company. But it was in 1984 that I was really shaken up to look at what was happening to agriculture. 1984 was the year Punjab had exploded into terrorism. Punjab was the land where the Green Revolution was first implemented. And the Green Revolution was supposed to create prosperity and therefore peace, and was supposed to be an alternative to the violent Red Revolution that was taking place in China. But in the late 1970s, early 1980s, Punjab had a lot of bloodshed. 30,000 people were killed in that period. And in June, the Golden Temple was invaded by the army. By November that year, Indira Gandhi, who had ordered the invasion, was killed by her own security forces. And I kept thinking, if this was supposed to be about peace, why is there no peace? What really happened to Punjab agriculture? Also, by December that year, we had the worst disaster, industrial disaster in human history, a leak from a pesticide plant in Bhopal, which killed 3,000 people that night and 30,000 people since then. So just 2 episodes in 1 year, and we're talking about 60,000 people gone. And again, worse than war. So I had to ask myself the question, why has agriculture become like war? What is this thing called the Green Revolution? And at the end of it, wrote my book, The Violence of the Green Revolution, through a program I was doing at that point with the United Nations University. I started to put the data together and found, first thing, it isn't that overall food production increased. Rice and wheat production increased. But food is more than rice and wheat. I mean, you can't eat a chapati alone. You need your little bit of sabji and you need your little bit of dal. When the dals had disappeared, pulses stopped being cultivated, oilseeds stopped being cultivated. The Green Revolution was one big monoculture of rice in one season and wheat in one season. So overall, actually, food production had not increased. Conversion to monocultures had increased, and conversion of 2 grains that had now become commodities had increased. This also changed something else dramatically in India. The assumption was the rest of India doesn't have to grow food, Punjab will become the breadbasket, and you will ship rice and wheat around the country. And this went hand in hand with declaring some really nutritious foods as inferior food. New language emerged. It was coarse grains, inferior food, and marginal foods. If you do a nutritional analysis of the foods that were displaced, like the millets, which are called coarse grains, they are 40 times more nutritious than polished rice and refined wheat flour. When I had my little boy, I was in Bangalore. In Bangalore, the regional crop is ragi, also called mandua, also called the finger millet, because it looks like that, and it has varieties. It's the open-handed millet, or the closed-fist millet, or the red millet, or the black millet. Beautiful. It has so much calcium and so much iron that no child would ever be deficient in calcium, weaned on this millet. Even the vegans would have a wonderful supply. I worry a bit about vegans not getting enough calcium. But a mandua diet, a finger millet diet would take care of it. All of these crops, rubbished. And I sometimes think it's partly because there was a focus on some commodities, but it was also, I think, because there is a racism in food just like there's a racism in other things. Yeah? The dark, the black, the brown, not good enough. The white, superior. And we know what a mess the superiority of white has given us in the area of food and nutrition. So when we celebrate millet festivals, we put a big banner saying black is beautiful. Because it makes black chapatis, it makes black bread, it makes black cookies, but black is beautiful. So whether it is in terms of the actual production of food or in terms of the nutritional content of food, we were losing nutrition in the period we were talking about producing more food through chemicals. And I think this is one of the biggest illusions that has led to the malnutrition crisis, both malnutrition crises. In terms of the decline in nutrition availability of chemically grown food, very few studies exist. In fact, this afternoon we were talking about, what's the areas of research that a center like this, the Center for Livable Futures, could really contribute to in terms of the link between food and public health. And I think the disappearance of nutrition in food and the production of empty mass, its only value is how much does it weigh, not how much will it give to your body. So there's a UK study called The Composition of Foods, which shows that between 1940 to 1991, vegetables had lost on average 24% of their magnesium, 46% of their calcium, 27% of their iron, and no less than 76% of their copper. For carrots, the loss was 75% of magnesium, 48% calcium, 46% iron, 76% copper. And for potatoes, 70% magnesium, 35% calcium, 45% iron, 47% copper. So you would need, as the author of the study, David Thomas, said, you'd need to eat 10 tomatoes in 9 to 1 to get the amount of copper that 1 tomato would give you. And there are other studies, including studies done by the Camden Institute, which shows that in organic food, you have iron 12% more, phosphorus 14% more, chromium 78% more, selenium 390% more, calcium 63% more, boron 70%, magnesium 138%, vitamin C 27%, vitamin E and beta-carotene 50%. Now, it's not a mystery that organically farmed food would have higher nutrition because the soil in which they grow has the nutrition. Chemical farming is based on what has been called by Albert Howard, so Albert Howard, the NPK mentality. Yeah? That soil is an empty container, it has nothing in it. You bring nitrogen fertilizer from old explosive factories, factories that used to make explosives during the war, and put that in, and you get phosphorus and you get potassium, and that's it. The problem is that for food, it isn't it. And in fact, nitrogen is now becoming a major part of the problem, both in terms of destroying soil health itself. These are salts. And one way I teach farmers is you take an earthworm, which is such an important organism in maintaining soil health, and Darwin, it's a Darwin year this year, and he's known much more about the origin of species, but he wrote a little book called something, the earthworm used to be called the mold. And he's written in this book how the most important creature on earth will be recognized in history as the earthworm. And he's done all this amazing research on what the earthworm was doing to the soil. Well, if you put urea on an earthworm, it's like putting salt on a leech. Do you know what a leech is? Yeah. In moist forests, get you. And the only way you can get rid of them is carry a little bit of salt and put it, and then they shed. But totally dehydrates them. And this is what's happening with the soils. Minute you go organic, the earthworm populations come back. And we do calculations. I mean, this is one thing we teach the farmers. Just watch the earthworms in your soil. See how many are able to live. And I think another very understudied area of work is how so many of the soil organisms actually give you new nutrients. It isn't the conservation of mass of physics. It's, life does not follow the laws of fixed NPK and fixed NPK out. No. The beings on the soil, through their amazing systems, are giving you additional elements. And in addition, the more you feed them, the more they're able to create nutrients for you, which then the plant is able to take up. And as it takes it up, it becomes our food. So the disappearance of nutrition, both in terms of agriculture as well as in terms of health, I think has given us bad, non-sustainable farming practices and health systems that are not able to prevent disease. Half of the disease burden of the world today is related to food. And even the part that's not, at the end of it, what do the doctors tell you? To eat well. Yeah? Every blood pressure patient and hypertension patient, every patient with cardiac problems, ultimately, we also do organic retail, and half our members are people having some health problem. Yeah? They can't eat the rubbish anymore. But we aren't growing food in order to provide what is needed. But there are other ways in which hunger has been created and nutritional deprivation has been built into the system of industrial farming. And this is, I think, the least known part of the equation. If a small peasant has to grow food with purchased seed that's non-renewable, with chemical fertilizers, and then chemically fertilized non-renewable crops normally are disease-prone, and therefore you need pesticides. And when you do these monocultures, you will have a flourishing of weeds, and you will need to have a douse of herbicides. All of this adds up to a huge debt problem. Again and again, when I travel in the rural areas of India, I find tribal women bringing their silverware, their silver ornaments, and pawning it to pay back the debt for the chemicals they bought in the last season. The other day I was in the eastern state of Jharkhand, and this old woman was harvesting her rice. And then her lunch came, and I said, you're eating your new harvest. And she was just eating it through, and she says, I can't eat my own rice. I have to sell it to the people I borrowed from for the chemicals. And that's what led me to invite the farmers of that region to say, come to our place, learn organic. You don't have to give up your food for the chemicals, because that's what's really happening. As chemicals spread, the growers of food are being denied the right to food. If you just look at the figures, I mean, till the war years, food deprivation and hunger used to be an urban phenomenon, because rural communities always stocked food. And even if they had a scarcity in one year, they'd be able to, tap. And there's still cultures in Rajasthan, which is a desert area, which therefore has, very frequent crop failures with rainfall failures. They have a culture of saving food as a common security for 5 years. They constantly keep a 5-year stock. And so even if you had a crop failure, you don't have a famine. It doesn't translate into a famine. On the other hand, if you have grown food on the basis of high-cost external inputs, then even if you have very, very lush fields, you go hungry. Hunger today is a rural phenomena. Hunger today is a problem of people who could be producing food if they were doing it in another way. And in the most extreme situation, it's this system of high-cost inputs and cheap buying, which is what industrial farming and globalized trade in food is. It has led to a tragedy that is totally new, and it should be seen as a public health tragedy. 200,000 farmers in India over the last decade have committed suicide. And the suicide started in the cotton areas where non-renewable seeds were being brought in. It was the year Monsanto tried to introduce on a large scale BT cotton, but BT cotton hadn't been approved by the government. And when I realized they were just selling it, I took the issue to court on the basis of our laws, and Monsanto was stopped from commercializing BT cotton. But they had already done a lot of releases and trials, so there was BT cotton out there. From 2002 onwards, they got the permission to do commercial sales. Today, if you do a map of where are the suicides are concentrated in areas where the BT cotton monopoly has been established. Now, again, people don't understand why would a farmer go for BT cotton. They have choice. Well, the genetic engineering industry knows if there's choice, no one will buy GM seeds if they're farmers. No one will eat GM foods if they're eaters. I have yet to meet somebody who votes for genetically modified food. Even the Monsanto canteen is GM-free. They don't eat it themselves. What happens when the industry goes into an area, especially in our part of the world, where farmers have had their seed? 80% of the seed supply till 10 years ago used to be farmers' own seed. And cotton has evolved in India. We've had high diversity of cotton varieties. We used to have 1,500 cotton varieties. And the government used to release new cotton varieties. Most of our cotton was cultivated as an intercrop. And the intercrop meant, a farmer could grow cotton, but rows of food crops. And so there was never hunger. But Bt cotton is a monoculture, and a monoculture means food disappears. But it also means, in the case of Bt cotton, the price of seed has jumped from 7 rupees a kilo to 17,000 rupees a kilo. Yeah? The 7 rupee seed could be saved year in and year out. You buy it once and you have it forever. The 17,000 rupee seed has to be bought every year. The 17,000 rupee seed is also more vulnerable to pests, in spite of the claim that Bt, which is a soil organism, and the genes pulled out and put into the plant, that this is a pest-resistant plant. Just like pesticides, which are supposed to control pests, ended up creating pests by destabilizing the ecological balance and destroying the predator-pest relationship. In the case of Bt cotton, the disruption of the plant's physiology and metabolism leads to it being more vulnerable to new pests. And pests that have never attacked cotton are now attacking cotton. Last year it was something called the mealy bug. 2 years ago, because it was the aphids and jacids. In the process, in the area where the highest suicides are, which is in central India, a part of Maharashtra state called Vidarbha, when highest planting of Bt cotton has happened, 4,000 farmers per year are committing suicide. That's one farmer every 6 hours. And the use of pesticide in 4 years since the planting started has increased 13-fold, 13 times more pesticide use. So every dimension, the farmers' costs are just shooting the sky. The last time I was visiting the area, farmers will tell me, that village, there's been a suicide, and I will always go. And this farmer Nayak, they always drink pesticide to end their lives. They always do it outside the home. The other thing is, your local seed is saved in the home, and normally women are the seed sievers. And as long as seed is in women's hand, it's, it's tested, it's tried, it's known. When these packages come from outside, they have to be bought in the local town. And it's usually the men who go to the local town, usually for a drink. And while they're sozzled, an agent comes and says, here's a miracle seed. It's come straight from God. And every god of India has been mobilized to sell these seeds. Guru Nanak, Hanumanji, everyone. Free salesman. And the farmer really believes it because, a simple peasant really believes it. If he's a Sikh, he really believes Guru Nanak. After all, he reads the Guru Granth Sahib every day. If you read the Ramayana every day, you believe that Hanuman brought this amazing herb to save the life of Lakshman. So if he's bringing you this amazing new seed, you believe in it. And the poor farmer puts a thumbprint. The land is mortgaged. And he comes home with the seed. The seed looks the same. It doesn't say I'm genetically engineered. It looks the same. It's planted. The wife has no idea what's happened. And it's usually on the day the agents come to collect the land, saying, now you haven't been able to pay up, now you give the land. That's the day the man drinks pesticide. And usually the wife comes to know only when his body is found somewhere, in a field, on a road. And Nayak's body was found. So when I visited, I asked her, I said, what did he get into debt for? And she just pointed. She was making chapatis for her children. She pointed to a box above the fire in a little hut, 8 feet by 10 feet. So I brought that package down, and every package was a Bt cotton package. But it was with different company names. Yeah? So it was Ankur, it was Mahalakshmi. One fails, they think I'll change. But they don't know they're not changing because it's the same BT. They're used to 50 companies with different names. They have no idea there's a company called Monsanto that has them all in licensing arrangements and collects royalties from all of them. And so in addition to the unreliability, high costs, and failure, the other side, also farmers are getting hit, which is the fourth aspect through which agriculture and food systems are being destabilized. And that aspect is the system that is called free trade, but has nothing free about it. I call it unfair trade. It's rules of unfair trade. And in the case of cotton, these rules of unfair trade have meant that cotton subsidized with $4 billion in the US, I think it's 25,000 farms, that's it. Very tiny number of farms get the $4 billion subsidies. This is then dumped on international markets. The WTO is used to force countries to open up markets. And when that highly subsidized cotton is dumped, the prices of cotton fall. So the farmer has spent 70,000, 100,000 growing the cotton and is able to earn 10,000, 15,000 at the end of it. There's no way that system of production can continue. And because it's happened so fast and so suddenly, the trauma of it is showing up in terms of subsidy. It's the same process that happened here. It took 100 years. And in the 100 years, people were also getting new opportunities in cities, in industry, in making automobiles, so it didn't pinch so hard. This is happening in India at a time where there's closure of every other source of employment. Industry is closing down. Manufacture is closing down. Cities are not able to absorb more people also because there's whole new speculation in spite of Slumdog Millionaire. Even that slum is marked for being bulldozed for real estate. They'll have nice high-rises, they'll have wonderful supermarkets. Well, the three aspects of the unfair trade agreement of WTO that directly hurt sustainable agriculture and directly hurt the ability of people to have access to food at affordable prices, nutritious food, quality food. One agreement that has been my preoccupation is a crazy agreement called TRIPS. And it's called TRIPS because it was never supposed to be TR. The word intellectual property is a new word created in these last 10, 15 years. We used to have something called industrial property and patents. And in a totally separate area, we had cultural creativity and copyright, design, etc. All of this was lumped into one and called intellectual property, so that every time you talked monopoly, what was cited was Madonna. You're all looking back, so you don't know that in Thailand they bring out elephants to stamp on Madonna CDs. Madonna and Michael Jackson, those were the two. I'm sure they're absolutely outdated now, but that was the big worry at that time. That someone making a low-cost copy of a Madonna record was a pirate, and then Madonna's right to her creativity was treated as equal to Monsanto's right to have seed monopoly. So intellectual property was created, my government negotiated and said, sorry, this is about national decision-making, national sovereignty. It's not about trade. You cannot drag these regimes into trade. India had been through 20 years of a national debate, democratic debate, to explore how our patent laws should look. And in 1970, we got a law which undid the imperial law of monopolies. And our 1970 law used to be treated as a perfect law for third world countries because it did not allow monopolies in medicine. It allowed innovation in medicine through process patents. If you innovated with something new, you got a process patent. But you could not patent the medicine itself because there was always the option that someone else could find another way to make it. And in the case of seeds and life and agriculture, absolutely no patenting allowed, totally excluded. So when India said, sorry, this has nothing to do with WTO, the Washington lawyers, they're super, super smart, they just put TR before IP. And they said, now it's trade-related by definition, so it must be negotiated in a trade treaty. And it was never negotiated anyway. Monsanto has been on record, and I've quoted this in my book, Biopiracy. They've said in getting this agreement, we achieved something unprecedented. We defined a problem, and the problem was that farmers save seeds. We offered a solution. The solution was, with intellectual property, declare farmer seed saving and seed exchange as an illegal act. And it's gone even further, where farmers' fields being contaminated through GM crops. It's the farmer whose field is polluted who's treated as the thief. And there's a case in Canada, but there are 1,500 cases in this country of farmers who were contaminated being treated as thieves. The result of this agreement has been that at this point you have 5 companies controlling the seed supply, and of them 70% seed supply is controlled by Monsanto. And Monsanto will only release GM seeds because for GM they can collect royalties. On GM they can claim patents. So they will not release open pollinated seeds that farmers can save. They will not release seeds of nutritious crops. I've even heard from an employee of Monsanto that they bought up a local seed company that used to grow amaranth greens. Not the green amaranth, but the amaranth greens, which are very popular in South India. Hundreds of varieties. The seed company was bought, the seed store, small amounts of packet put, sent to St. Louis, and the rest set on fire. Basically, the idea is there should be no seed in people's hands except what is bought from Monsanto, and the only thing bought from Monsanto at this point is genetically engineered seed. I'm very, very happy today because yesterday would have been a date on which the European Commission wanted to vote down the bans that European countries have on GMOs, especially countries like Austria and Hungary. Those 2 countries were under vote, but France has a ban, Greece has a ban. And again and again, Monsanto has tried to say these bans are illegitimate. They even used the WTO to file a case against European Union. And we had a huge campaign, gave 1 million signatures, and said, if you try and take away our right to choose the food we eat, then we'll just have to continue the Seattle process, and you won't look very good. So the WTO ruling, in fact, was very, very mild. The European Commission tried yesterday, and we've done a lot of work over the last 10 days. The bans have stayed. And countries that were supporting GMOs have, a country like Spain that I've been briefing, they've totally switched and said, no, we've got to stop this stuff. Because they're now connecting the fact that it's not about technology. Anyway, technology doesn't exist disembodied. It's about seed. It's about food. Monsanto constantly tries to pull this into the discussion on technology. And, you know, my work on seeds of suicide, they've gone around saying it's fraudulent and I'm lying, there are no suicides. Farmers are thrilled, there's $27 million additional income, et cetera, et cetera. And always the discussion will be technology. Saying, and if BT is not doing well, it's because the farmers were stupid and the soil was wrong. My response always is, there is nothing like an abstract technology. The technology is in the food, and therefore we have to discuss the food. What kind of food does it give us? It is in the seed. What kind of seed does it give us? I think time has gone long past where this abstraction could be used. And I really feel after the collapse of Wall Street last year, all abstractions that have no responsibility linked to them and have no realism linked to them should be buried forever. You know, that mess that was created with derivatives and this and that, and often the mess created through science that serves narrow interests. It goes further and further and further away from reality, prevents us from knowing what's happening to the body of the earth or our bodies, and constantly causes harm. The second agreement of WTO that is causing harm is the agreement on agriculture. And as I said, it has nothing to do with agriculture. It doesn't have a line about farmers. It doesn't have a reference to soil. It doesn't have a reference to food. It has 3 clauses. Market access, export competition, domestic support. It's all about grabbing markets one way or the other. And that's really how the price speculation of food commodities in Chicago, in the commodity exchange, led to trigger effects around the world. Because as the food systems get integrated, they don't even actually have to trade. It's a bit like the light signal. Yeah? Price signal is like a light signal. If prices are going up or going down and the systems are integrated, then in Vietnam, prices of rice will go up or go down. Right now, the price of rice is collapsing. Last year, it was shooting through the skies. And rice-growing countries are in a huge problem. So agriculture agreement has caused a lot of distress around the world because it has been an instrument of dumping, it has been an instrument of monopoly, and it has been an instrument of speculation. The third agreement is called the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement, and is basically the so-called Food Safety Agreement. Now, we've had many issues around this. A few years ago, 98 it was, the soya lobby wanted to dump a lot of soya oil on India, and we don't like soya oil. So somehow mysteriously, little contamination happened in Delhi, not in any other city, not village, only Delhi, and all our indigenous oils were banned. And then a new law was created that unless oil is sold packaged, and every oil extractor have 2 chemists in their employ. Now, India, 1 million tiny virgin oil mills called ghanis work at village level, where you bring your groundnut or you bring your mustard, and in front of your eyes, it's extracted. You take back the oil, you leave the oil cake. The ghani owner doesn't take money, takes the oil cake, feeds his animals with it, and it's a totally sustainable economy. You can't have contamination in that. But these 1 million were shut down. Farmers growing indigenous oil seeds were also closed down. On the flight over, the Herald Tribune has this very interesting piece. German bakers face down EU taste police. Most of the time, SPS measures translate into the size of something. Yeah? What should be the size of the cucumber? If you wonder why all apples look the same, it's these SPS measures that have been used. And the way it's implemented is they have a tray with holes in it. Yeah? If the apple goes through, it's going to kill you. Little apples. Same for potatoes. Why is every potato the same size? And it's always the size of the McDonald's pack. What they used to be called French fries. And then the French didn't want to support the war, so they became freedom fries. But they're always that size, the potatoes. And it's because of this crazy sanitary and phytosanitary measures, which get hooked on the one hand to uniformity of crops and crop breeding, and on the other hand to the industrialization of food processing. Of course, behind it is now coming up a lot of, besides the 2 crops of herbicide-resistant and Bt, they come up with these stories of nutrition crops. And golden rice is the best. Yeah? It's going to solve all blindness. But when they were promoting it, I did rough calculations, one would have needed to eat 3 kilos of rice to get the daily requirement. Amaranth leaves, coriander leaves, curry leaves, which we use, drumstick leaves we use on a daily basis, have up to 1,400 micrograms. Golden rice has 34. They might get it to 50. So you need to eat this much of chutney, 1 spoonful of a green salad, 1.5 tablespoonfuls of a mint chutney, 1 carrot, 1 mango, 3 fresh apricots, and instead of that, you need 100 you need 3 kilograms of so-called golden rice. And interestingly, because it's a public health school, there is a big debate right now taking place in Tufts University, because somehow Tufts University is involved in testing out this non-approved, it's not approved yet for planting, but they're testing it out on vulnerable children. The tests going on. I think China, they had started and that has stopped, but they are, if you can go to the Tufts website. In any case, in the case of genetically engineered crops, you actually have a lowering of yield for the same variety into which the GM trait has been introduced because of a phenomena that has been named the yield drag. So it is not true that genetic engineering will overcome hunger. It's not true that genetic engineering will give us more food. So what will give us more food, more nutrition? I think we are at a watershed. The industry that first gave us the green revolution, which was a chemical revolution, and then gave us genetic engineering, is trying to move very fast into using genetically modified foods as feeding programs of vulnerable children. You know, these are called nutrition wars in India, big wars. What will be fed to children in ICDS schemes? Yeah. Will it be GM vitamin A, or will it be vitamin A sources from biodiversity? There is, of course, the kind of paradigm we've been trying to evolve through practice over the last 21 years. And in this paradigm, the heart of it is biodiversity itself. Because the more biodiversity you have, the more nutrition you have. This works at the agricultural level. Nutrition per acre is the highest for biodiverse farms. Biological production per acre is highest for biodiverse farms. Incomes of poor farmers per acre is highest for biodiverse farms. The farmers who are now doing organic farming in the cotton area with us, earning 10 times more than the farmers who were doing BT cotton. And this is the real anti-poverty step to take. But even for eaters, biodiversity is vital. Because the supermarket diversity is not nutritional diversity. You know, I did my doctoral work in Canada, and I used to go dizzy walking down the aisle of Campbell's soups, because the ingredients were just the 4 ingredients, you know. The name on the label was different. And now, of course, everything in your diet is soya and corn. Everything is soya and corn. You can't escape it. You can't escape the sugar from high fructose corn syrup. You can't escape soya in all its forms. Even when the dals went down in India, there was an attempt to create a project called analog dals. And guess what the analog dals were going to be? Yeah? We have chickpea, we have black gram, we have green gram, we have lentil, we have pigeon pea. You know, the reason all these names are animal names is because the British fed this stuff to cattle. They didn't know you can make wonderful dishes with it. And humans need it for proteins. In the case of the analog dals, they were going to have it all based on soya and then just extrude it into different shapes and dye it with different colors. I mean, we have to be getting highly desperate as a species to have to do that, you know? When we could get nice, good, diverse dals with all their different, unique tastes. The production paradigm, of course, has to change, and it has to change in terms of centering diversity, centering ecology, centering sustainability, but you can only do this on the small scale. Therefore, small farms end up having a cutting edge on the ecological transition. There's this new study that's out, and it's on the page of Gateway. It's called the International Assessment of Agricultural Science and Technology Development. 400 scientists working over 4 years have concluded that neither the Green Revolution nor genetic engineering is a solution for food insecurity. Small farms doing farming ecologically and organically is the way to feed the world. But then we have to match this shift in production with a shift in distribution. We've got a crazy system of distribution where 5 companies control the trade. Then they go cut down the Amazon forest to grow more soya, as if we had too little soya, and ship things around the world. By the way, the reason they even found out there are only 5 companies controlling the grain supply was when there was a trade sanction against the Soviet Union and in the 70s, and yet American wheat landed in the Soviet Union. And a journalist called Dan Morgan said, what is going on? What's happening that in spite of a trade sanction, our wheat can land in the Soviet Union? So he started to follow things through, found Cargill, found Continental, and wrote a brilliant book out of that period of investigation called Merchants of Grain, on the consolidation of the trade and distribution in food, which has, of course, since WTO become even more consolidated. So if we have to make a transition for people having the right to food and access to good, healthy, safe, culturally diverse food, fresh food, seasonal food, then localization is an imperative, an absolute imperative. Doesn't mean you deny yourself our wonderful pepper, and it doesn't mean you don't drink your coffee, but it does mean staple foods need to be grown where they're consumed. And what I call the spice of life food can travel long distance. But the spice of life food is just a tiny bit, not volumes. Staple food is volumes of food. So we need to cut down the volumes, both to stabilize prices, to guarantee farmers an access to just and fair trade, to guarantee all eaters, including those who aren't well off, access to food, because the more you tighten the food links and make the food chain short, the less rupture you have between the price the farmer gets and the price people have to pay. What is happening is a polarization of prices, where the farmers are getting less and less every year, and people are paying more and more every year, and that middle is the super profits of the grain companies and the food processing industry. So we need to close that down, but that can only close down with more direct relationships. This is also an imperative for climate change. We can't afford long-distance food miles with everything we eat. Every day's hunger, every day's meal cannot be linked to 5,000 miles of travel or whatever we are eating. We have to localize to reduce food miles. And as my new book, Soil Not Oil, says, we could solve 40% of the climate problem by going ecological and going local in our food systems. Because if you add the food production impact of industrial agriculture and the greenhouse emissions there, with nitrogen, methane from factory farming, and carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide from long-distance transport, and the carbon dioxide from burning forests to grow cheap feed or cheap biofuel, you add it all up, we are talking about a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But the wonderful thing with sustainability in agriculture is the same steps that allow you to conserve the resources of the earth also allow small farmers to live on the land and have a livelihood. It also allows food to be guaranteed to all. It allows more nutrition. It guarantees public health. And it solves the climate problem. I would add, it actually also solves the employment problem. Because I think the assumption that we can keep removing farmers off the land and continue to have food doesn't work anymore. We get, like I said, we get non-food when farmers don't produce. When food is produced by giant machinery and toxic chemicals, you get something other than what your body is calling for. So we need farmers to grow food, and if we need farmers to grow food, society must work out the mechanisms that allow farmers to be on the land, to get enough of a compensation. We need to shift from a food system that is not just based on monopolies and ill health and disease and non-sustainability. It's also based on lives. every price of every food item is a lie. It doesn't tell the truth of what it costs to produce it. So we need to move to a truthful economy of food, a truthful economy that's true to the planet's laws, to Gaia's laws, that's true to the laws of our body and our health, and that is true to the marketplace of a just trade and a just distribution. And I think all these challenges look big, but they're very, very doable. After all, there are millions of people creating these alternatives. We've done our bit in India with 400,000 farmers, and my aim is in the next 2 years to reach 1 million organic growers who will be seed savers, climate protectors, producers of healthcare, and dignified human beings who don't have to commit suicide, but can look forward to future generations. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you can tell. You were very appreciated. We have a modest book called Saving Lives, Protecting Health Millions at a Time. There's nothing shy about Johns Hopkins, Bloomberg School of Public Health. And we'll mail it to you, rather than have you carry it in your luggage. But I inscribed in here for Dr. Vandana Shiva in grateful appreciation of your work and your willingness to give the 9th Annual Dodge Lecture, signed by me on behalf of the Center for a Livable Future. And you will see in here a cartoon, the best cartoon in the book. Polly Walker and Sean McKenzie and I don't know how many other people labored over. It's our famous "If we ate the way we eat in America" slide. I'm sure most of you have seen this who've been in the audience and been to previous CLF events, but it shows the carrying capacity of the earth if we ate sustainably raised, high-grain fruit and vegetable diet rather than industrially produced high meat. So we have some time for questions. Yes. Yes.
I noticed in here that you wrote a book called Water Wars, and one of my concerns about food is that it uses so much water. And I totally agree with everything you've said, but the thing I'm most concerned about, water being the essential ingredient as well for living. So I'm just, and I read in India is really losing a lot of their water supply, wells being dug a lot deeper and not sustaining very long. So I'm curious about your perspective on the water use for food.
Yeah, it isn't true that agriculture uses more water. Industrial agriculture uses more water. And I think we always need to qualify because whether it's greenhouse gas emissions or it's water utilization. When I was doing the Green Revolution study, I found that chemically grown rice or wheat was using 10 times more water. Yeah. If you grow the millets that I was talking about earlier, they use only 250 millimeters of water. But not only do they use only 250 millimeters of water compared to 2,500 for irrigated chemically grown paddy, yeah, they actually build the soil's capacity to conserve moisture because they have high biomass. Because when I wrote my book called Monocultures of the Mind, what I realized was what was being measured in terms of the productivity of farms was what left the farm as a commodity. And meantime, what stayed on the farm was disappearing. So the sustenance of the soil was disappearing. The family, the household growing the food, its entitlement to food was disappearing, but more commodities were moving into international trade. And that is what is measured. It's the same as GNP. What's measured is the money that moves, not the production that actually takes place, or not the welfare of the people. So it's always what goes out that gets measured. And because of that, what happens is you put less and less organic matter back to the soil, and you don't grow biologically rich systems. Millets are usually produce much more biological matter. And the more you grow them, the more you put it back, the more the water moisture is conserved, and you can conserve 10 times more moisture in the soil, so you don't need irrigation. Just a little bit of rainfall. In Rajasthan, they grow food with 4 inches of rain because they conserve every bit of moisture in the farms. And the idea that you have to have irrigation, the idea that you have to have a 2,000 millimeter availability is part of the industrial agriculture package. Ecological farming, biodiverse farming, actually is not just not a consumer of water, it's a producer of clean water. Because what goes down into the soil is filtered, clean, wonderful drinking water.
I was hoping that you could guide me in what I can do as an individual to contribute to the mission of changing our crops from genetically modified to organic.
It's very simple. Just make sure you buy from an organic farmer. Go to an organic market.
The question was, what can the questioner do to help control the spread of GMO, bioengineered foods? Yes.
Hi, Dawn Moncrief with Farm and the Well-Fed World campaign. I was very glad to see you mention the rainforest being cut down for feed, and I was wondering if in your book, Soil Not Oil, if you discussed the benefits of reducing meat consumption on a global level, especially with the high-income consumers in countries like the U.S. and Europe who consume so much per capita.
I don't think I've addressed that too much because I was far more worried about the cars guzzling it all up. Yeah, but definitely we worked a lot on reducing the meat consumption, and while reducing meat consumption, also remembering that the poor cows are being punished by being fed grain. They're herbivores. Let's give them grass.
I can't resist adding a little pitch for the Center for Livable Future. In the United States, and this goes to your question as well, what can you do? 65% of our dietary protein is from animal sources, and globally it's 30%. And what is it in India? Would it be about 5 to 10%? 5%. And since it takes, going back to the earlier question, about 1,000 tons of water to produce a ton of grain, it takes 7 tons of grain to produce a ton of industrial meat, cattle, in feedlots. You do the math, and the decision you make, what you eat this evening, is the most important impact you can have on water, on greenhouse gas emissions, on food equity, and so forth, right?
Right. And my book, Stolen Harvest, has a chapter on this, I remember. It's called The Sacred Cow versus the Mad Cow. And I think for research institutions, this is so important because the reason GM is spreading is there's a totally unjustified principle operating. And it was created again in Washington. How much stuff that travels the world gets created in Washington. And the principle is called substantial equivalence. Just assume equivalence and don't look for the difference. But those mad cows that were fed all this rendered meat, the protein was equivalent substantially, but it was not equivalent structurally. It was a deformed protein that became the prion and became a self-infective agent. And even in GMOs, that's why there isn't, they're not looking, because they're just assuming that it's exactly as the parent organism. And what we need to do is much more the difference in terms of the feed, in terms of, at the GM level as well as at the other level in terms of what's fed to animals. But I think overall, biodiversity is the answer, including protein from biodiversity. For me, the 2 crops for the future, that's what we should take up as a livable future project. One is bring dals back into fashion, and the other is bring millets back into fashion.
Okay. Yes.
I was wondering if you had followed the U.S. Farm Bill at all and what the strengths and weaknesses were. I've also always wondered if there's a connection between U.S. farm policy and the farmer suicides that you mentioned.
I haven't followed the U.S. Farm Bill. you usually kind of do these things if a friend or colleague brings it to you and says, we need your input. Definitely in terms of the farmers' suicides, there's a very, very intimate connection. The connection begins with the fact that India used to have seed sovereignty. We made our own seed. And with liberalization, which includes the opening up of the market as well as the seed monopolies, that was all part of US foreign policy. The use of food as a weapon in the Vietnam War was part of US foreign policy. India being forced to import wheat 2 years ago when we had enough wheat for our people. That's part of US foreign policy. Right now, the laws being rewritten, and I have to work very hard at defending our regulatory system. It's very, very much part of US foreign policy. And there is actually an agreement. There was a nuclear agreement signed between India and the US, but at the same time, an agriculture agreement was also signed. And on the board of this agreement sit Monsanto, Walmart, and ADA. So quite clearly for US foreign policy, getting access to markets, converting food and converting hunger to markets is part of the problem. And there is going to be a hearing. The International Trade Commission, it's called ITC, is doing an investigation on India not opening up enough and turning us, not being a bigger market for US agricultural products. And I think there's a submission at the end of this month, but I could forward to you this thing, because I think those are kind of inputs where we all have to put the common nutritional rights and common rights to sustainable livelihoods in India, in the US, in Poland, everywhere in the world, and work towards systems that work for everyone rather than systems that destroy someone else to make it work for some tiny group of people.
I need to put in a little plug. Ronnie, would you stand up, please? Any of you in the public health community who want to be involved in the 2012 Farm Bill and its public health implications, Ronnie is coordinating with Becca. Where's Becca Klein? Stand up, Becca. So these two ladies are regularly on conference calls with APHA and other public health people throughout the country so that we get a running head start on the public health aspects of the 2012 Farm Bill. We were a little late off the blocks for the 2008, 2007 Farm Bill, but this is really an important issue, an important question. Yes, sir.
Not too far from this building is a community where children go to school hungry. And it's pervasive throughout Baltimore City. There is now, I believe, a movement of different people who are trying to address this question. Baltimore City school systems have been at the forefront of this. They've brought in some wonderful people, Dr. Alonso, Tony Gerasi, and they've taken the lead on it. There was also a conference a few weeks ago out in Baltimore County where we brought local farmers together with the consumers in trying to establish that kind of a relationship, that kind of distributional relationship. So there are these things happening right here in Baltimore, and I'm sure more and more we will be coming here to you folks at Hopkins for some support and let you know how it's going and work in some kind of partnership with you.
I'm going to ask Ann Palmer to stand up. So if you don't know each other, you need to talk. Tony Gerasi and I were with Becca in Congressman Elijah Cummings' office last Thursday after a briefing on the reauthorization of the Child Nutrition Act. And we struck a really responsive chord with regard to his interest. And Tony, of course, gave a wonderful, fervent advocacy statement about the 33-acre farm that's being developed on the city line. So thank you for, yes, Ed, Dr. Dodge.
I'm curious to know if Monsanto is giving you any kind of difficulties with your spreading organic farming in India.
They try to create difficulties, but we turn it into a a reason to spread it more. I'll just give you two examples. In, must have been about 2000, they put in newspapers, and it's very easy for them to plant stories because these days, even newspapers, you know, will put anything for money. Yours more. We've learned it from you. And the story about how, you know, organic was a Western imperialist import. And that's when I started the Albert Howard lectures on Gandhi's birthday. Because Sir Albert Howard had come to India in 1905. He'd been sent to introduce chemicals. As he says in his book, The Agricultural Testament, I realized the soils were fertile. I realized there were no pests. I threw away my spray gun and decided to turn the pest and the peasant into my teachers. Out of it came the father of modern organic farming. And we, just to let people know, we do a Howard lecture annually, and last year Prince Charles gave it on Gandhi's birthday, because on Gandhi's birthday we want to emphasize the fact that what we want to promote is a non-violent farming, because what we have in the form of an industrial agriculture is a violent farming. Now, 2 years after that was 10 years after Rio, so the Earth Summit of Johannesburg. And because it was in Johannesburg, there were lots of African peasants, and they would invite me all over the place. And then Monsanto had a stall in which they put a huge banner saying, Vandana Shiva is not an African. Yeah. You know, the peasants knew I'm not an African. I knew I'm not an African. But they thought we can't have solidarity. Yeah? They took out a march against me. And then the best was, we was doing a press conference, and I was surrounded by media people, and I couldn't see. But a hand came through with 2 lumps of cow dung. And I said, oh, an organic farmer has brought me cow dung. And this representative who I know from India said, no, it's the bullshit award for making the world starve with organic. And so I said, well, thank you so much. You call it bullshit, I call it cow dung. It still makes very, very good compost. And we will build the organic movement with this. So we have to, you know, we have to keep doing these things.
Yes, way in the back.
Where I've traveled to agricultural countries, and it's not many, but I see that the young people are not finding farming as a dignified way to live anymore. And of course, if we don't pay fair prices for food, you probably wouldn't. If you have no access to markets, you probably wouldn't. But how do you change that mentality? Or I don't know if this is a world phenomenon that young people don't want to farm anymore. It's not, you know, they don't have jobs, they don't have anything to eat, but their grandmothers are the only ones working. They're not interested in that kind of
you know, it's true when farming is so degraded, both in terms of a constant message that it's part of an obsolete human activity that should be made to disappear. You know, look at any reference, the terms used for farmers are so degrading that culturally we have constantly put down the producers of our food. And culturally, therefore, we have to lift them. I constantly refer to them as it's been referred to in our scriptures, annadatas, the givers of food, the providers of food. So we have to respect food and farming in order for that message to go to future generations. But that's not enough. You can culturally respect them, and the twisted price on the international market doesn't get them enough, and they will have to leave their farm. So we have to start intervening in the way prices work. Now, governments are starting to look at that kind of issue in other fields, but in agriculture, they're still not looking, because agriculture is still treated as a second-rate activity. And I think the role of centers like the Center for the Livable Future is to bring food into center stage of our economic life, our social life, our cultural life, and our political life. You know, the reason I've set up a farm and I do training and I've started the School of the Seed called Bij Vidyapeeth where we do offer some international courses, is because through this we want to bring dignity back to farming. Through this we want people to know it can be so exciting. And I love it when a software engineer comes to us and says, I'm getting so bored in Silicon Valley. Can I become an organic farmer? And we say, yes.
We have time for 2 more questions. Alan?
You were mentioning earlier, you were alluding to the international kind of neoliberalist economic structure that has created their policies of euphemistically known as free trade, or as you said, unfair trade. And one of their organizations that is the arbiter of that trade is the World Trade Organization. Is there a movement out there that wants to create a world free trade movement, or a fair trade movement rather?
Yeah,
Like it's the actual, that organization is directly affecting the farmers that you were talking about through the monopolies of larger corporations.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a movement even before WTO was born that we need alternatives. And I remember in '93, I had 500,000 farmers on the streets of Bangalore to say this is the wrong way to arrange our food system. Again and again, at the WTO meetings, we've shown what trade routes should really look like if good food, sustainable food, local food systems had to be rewarded. So it's not that difficult to work with me. And I'm actually very glad that WTO doesn't have the kind of momentum it did. And I'm further quite glad that, in a way, it didn't take the movements against globalization to bring down globalization. It took the distortions of globalization itself to bring globalization down. And, the collapse on Wall Street, the financial collapse, is creating a new responsibility for us to work on systems that work. And that's why, especially in the US, I feel you all were so dynamic and so motivated in bringing Obama to power. And I think you need to be equally motivated to build the food systems that you want to see. Because if you could put him in the White House, you can do a lot more with that same energy. And redefining the food system in this country would help us get the political space to redefine it in our countries.
Last question. Professor Humphrey.
I'm always concerned and angered by our political system that rewards campaign contributions from Cargill and from the people that have all of the resources, that buys the Congress, that makes all of these decisions that hurt the people in general. And the thing that's linked to that is the Supreme Court decision, I think it was 1866, that decided that corporations were to be treated equally with individuals with the same kind of rights that individuals presumably have, but given immortality. We're not seeing any of these organizations, these corporations and so on that brought us to the current difficulties being killed, dying, being put in prison. They're corporations, they're not individuals, and so on. And I think that some of the things that we're talking about need to be linked to some general changes in our society and the way we govern ourselves.
Would you like to respond? We've had 10 years of this
debate.
discussion.
Okay, sure. Now, well,
I agree with what he said.
and this here is another fictitious construct that needs to go. That the corporation as a total fiction of having a personality, a human personality, and having rights equal to human beings, except that by the time rules and policies and laws are written by corporations, for corporations, of corporations, they end up taking citizenship away from ordinary human beings. And that, I think, is the real crisis that the unfair trade that calls itself free trade is. Because ordinary people lost their ordinary civic liberties. And part of what, I don't think we can solve this particular economic crisis without having fundamental shifts in the way we see, experience democracy and freedom. that you can't have an economic dictatorship in the core areas of how food is produced and distributed, and still think you can live in a democracy. Democracy means food democracy. It means water democracy. It means seed democracy. You need the practice of that democracy brought into every one of these spheres. And that's why, again, the organic movement for me is so important, because in real practical ways, it's shifting the ground.
Thank you. We'll